Okay, we are live. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On today's show, I have a very special guest, returning guest. His name is Hans Schantz. Last name is spelled Schantz. And this will be our third show. We've done a show just about 2 months ago. We covered his book, which I highly recommend. It's a new book. It's titled The Whys of Heart, a modern day reimagining of the Scopes monkey trial. And then we also did a part one. This will be a part two. And it's been titled on this talk, which you will see the presentation and the slides if you're watching this on Rockfin, Rumble, or X. It's titled Einstein, Relativity, and Modern Physics. And just kind of, I think we covered a number of topics in the last one. Relativity. We talked about some of these slides, the theory of relativity. I can't say I'm a physics expert by any stretch of the imagination, but that's why he's here. But we talked about it kind of goes into the politicization of a lot of stuff. That everything seems to be political anyway these days. We talked about Einstein coming to America, the eclipse of 1919, kind of the foundations of general relativity. And also there's a lot to talk about and some interesting questions I remember from our conversation that we had in May about how it's interesting that Einstein wasn't invited onto the Manhattan Project.
Sorry.
Hans has also two websites. Let me see if we have his Substack, which is at Aetherzar. It's AETHER.substack.com. You can see all this information on there. And then also there is Aetherzar.com, which is his website. You'll see his fiction books here too, The Hidden Truth. One commenter, Ken Holder, said the best science fiction techno thriller since whatever Neil Stephenson's last book was. So you can check those out. And he also goes into ultra wide. I think one of his books was the Art and Science of Ultra Wide Band Antennas. Pretty technical stuff, but you can see some of his books on Amazon. But hopefully we'll get the technical stuff figured out. Welcome, everybody. Hoping you're having an okay time considering world events. Pretty strange days indeed. Yeah, we talked about this last time. The last show we did was April 22nd, 2025. No, that was the first one we did, The Whys of Heart. And then May 21st is the first part of this. The Zionist clash was inevitable. I mean, this is present stuff like Zionism. It was one resulting from differences in standards. The Easterners, like many Russian Jews in this country, don't know what honesty is, and we simply won't entrust our money to them. Weitzman does not know what honesty is, but weakly yields to his numerous Russian associates, hence the split. Einstein to Frankfurter, a Jewish weakness always and eagerly to try to keep the Gentiles in good humor. Establishment Jewish press motivated to focus on Einstein to distract from Zionists, so Zionist Organization of America sided with Weitzman. Hello, welcome back.
I can finally hear you.
Okay. It's not your fault. There's something going on with StreamYard. I don't know what it is. It's not stable.
Everything was going fine, and then it just, all the sound stopped.
The last show did that exact same thing to me, like literally mid-show. I had to have a buddy of mine host it. He was my guest, and he flipped into host, so it's not your fault. Anyway, I was just kind of reading through these slides. I did a long background again, and we're back to Einstein Comes to America. So I kind of just read this and just showed that there was a kind of propaganda or PR campaign about him, and then moved on to this one. So if you're ready, we can just take it from here, if that's okay.
Sure, I'll take it from here.
And I'll edit it. I'll edit this for the listeners on the live stream. I'll edit it out and put out the full audio with that 5 minutes missing. I could have stopped the stream, but it would have been a real difficulty to reset it back up and redo it. So anyway, I apologize to everybody. I've had problems with StreamYard. If you listen to my show regularly, you'll know I'm just having a real hard time. So anyway, Hans, welcome back. So I apologize for that.
Well, thank you. And again, I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you and with your audience. Where we left off last time, we were talking about Einstein's unprecedented publicity on his trip to America and some of the factors behind it. One of those factors was rivalry among various groups within the American Jewish community. There were newly arrived Eastern European and Russian Jews who were on board with the Zionist program, that Einstein was there raising funds with Chaim Weizmann, the head of the World Zionist Organization, ultimately the first president of Israel. And they were not looked upon with favor by some in the establishment American Jewish community. And that ironically led to more publicity for Einstein, because the establishment Jewish press emphasized the Einstein aspect of the tour by way of distracting from the Zionist fundraising.
Gotcha.
So, next.
Okay, let's go.
And that was no doubt frustrating for the American establishment Jewish community, but Einstein was also a frustration for Chaim Weizmann and the Zionist organization. Einstein's friend Blumenfeld warned Weizmann before the trip that Einstein was not really a Zionist, intended to say things that perhaps he shouldn't. He also argued that the Zionists should work harder to make peace with their Arab neighbors. And Weizmann, in turn, said that Einstein was a prima donna about to lose her voice. The tension continued when Israel had its war for independence in 1948. Einstein signed on a letter criticizing Herut, which is a right-wing political party that ended up being absorbed into the Likud party. But ultimately, I guess there were no hard feelings, because a few years later, he was offered the position of president of Israel, which he declined. Next. So just summarizing what Einstein, the facts around Einstein's publicity tour in America, it was clearly a kind of events and circumstances publicity campaign, where we got to see the huge crowds that came out to see Weizmann and the Zionist party, but were interpreted as crowds for Einstein. But even though there was the massive crowds, Einstein really contributed to that through his charisma, his appeal. He made a favorable impression on reporters, and the alignment with the zeitgeist, the notion that relativity proved that truths were no longer absolute, contributed to the cultural acceptance of relativity theory.
Gotcha.
Well, this brings us to a interesting question that it needs to be tackled with some sensitivity, but it's a very important topic for understanding the narrative underlying the history of science, and of course had very significant influence on world history. And that's the conflict between Jewish physicists and the advocates of what was called Deutsche physics, or German physics, in the Weimar years, and then after the Nazis took over. And it's also important to look at what was going on and try to set aside our modern day sensibilities, because people at the time had views that we today, with our modern perspectives, would regard as being blatantly racist and anti-Semitic. In fact, one very prominent German physicist declared that Jews are a group of people unto themselves, that their Jewishness is visible in their physical appearance, that they notice their Jewish heritage in their intellectual works, and they have the same way of thinking and of feeling. Now, that physicist, the next slide, was Albert Einstein himself, in a pamphlet on anti-Semitism that he published in 1918. Next. So if we want to ask what Jewish physics is and see, just analyze for a moment Einstein's argument that there is such a thing and that it's of significance, one of the first ways we could approach it is to speculate that, well, perhaps Jewish physics is just what you get when Jewish physicists do physics. For relativity, it's hard to advance that, because it was clearly a mix of Jews and non-Jews who contributed relativity. Now, Einstein certainly had the leading voice in what became the modern theory of relativity, but it was definitely a mixture. And even if we look at quantum mechanics, while Niels Bohr, who was one of the pioneers, had a Jewish mother, If we go to the next slide, Werner Heisenberg really was the founder of the new theory, according to Einstein's friend Max Born. Now, he was in a youth group, the White Knights, that got absorbed into the Hitler Youth. Heisenberg participated in one of the paramilitary organizations that helped overthrow the Bavarian Socialist Republic, and he was trusted enough to be head of the German atomic weapons development program. So, it's hard to make a case for him as being a Jewish physicist. Next. And also, Heisenberg wasn't alone in creating quantum mechanics. Now, some have criticized quantum mechanics as the quintessential sort of Jewish science, formalistic, removed from observation, entirely concerned with symbol manipulation. But it was completed by Einstein's Jewish friend, Max Born, and by Pascual Jordan. In fact, his contribution was so significant, Einstein proposed that Heisenberg, Born, and Jordan should share a Nobel Prize for their contributions. But Pascual Jordan, at the same time he was working on quantum mechanics, was actually contributing to nationalist magazines in Weimar, Germany, like Blut und Boden, Blood and Soil, under a pseudonym, and writing, relatively extreme nationalist or right-wing essays. Next. So clearly, it was a mix of Jewish and non-Jewish contributors responsible for quantum mechanics. So to uphold the argument that anyone who supported quantum mechanics had to be Jewish, Heisenberg's opponents coined the term a white Jew to describe someone who may not be ethnically or racially Jewish, but was upholding Jewish ideas like quantum mechanics was supposed to be. Now, ironically, Heisenberg's mother was also friends with the mother of Heinrich Himmler, who was the head of the Gestapo. And Heisenberg's mom got together with Himmler's mom and persuaded her to talk to her son Heinrich about getting his people to lay off her son, and was successful in that. After Himmler did his own investigation, he concluded, I believe Heisenberg is a decent person, and we cannot afford to lose or kill this man who is relatively young and can educate a new generation. Next. Now, these attitudes that Einstein had were shared by many of his non-Jewish colleagues. Like, for instance, Sommerfeld wrote to Lorentz, who came up with the Lorentz transforms that are key to relativity. And Sommerfeld wrote that as ingenious as Einstein's approach to special relativity is, it seems to me there's something almost unhealthy in their non-constructive and non-visualizable dynamics. An Englishman would hardly have put forth such a theory. Perhaps what is expressed here is the conceptually abstract nature of the Semite. I hope you will be able to breathe some life into this ingenious conceptual framework. Now, this was clearly not meant in a derogatory fashion. In fact, Sommerfeld wrote to Vine a year earlier that he had now studied Einstein, who impresses me greatly. So Sommerfeld also did the first class in relativity in Germany, as well as the first course on Bohr's quantum mechanics. So he was on board with the physics, just objected to some of the aesthetic aspects of it. Next. Now, Einstein wrote privately to Bohr, I'm confident that Jewish physics is not to be killed in the middle of World War II. And Born wrote back, I've always appreciated your good Jewish physics, but it's evident from what Born wrote that he had a relatively narrow view of what constituted Jewish physics, that it was trying to get hold of the laws of nature by thinking alone, engaging in thought experiments. Next. Next. Okay. Now, Einstein himself had a somewhat loose association between fact or experiment and theory. In 1919, he was asked what his reaction would have been if the eclipse had disproved general relativity. And Einstein's reaction was to say, well, then I would feel sorry for the good Lord because the theory is correct anyway. In a debate with Nernst, on the other hand, Nernst spoke of a certain causal relationship, and Einstein remarked, I don't think this relationship holds good. But my esteemed colleague, replied Nernst, it is just this relationship upon which you yourself quite recently insisted in a lecture. To his amazement, Einstein replied, how can I help it if the good Lord will not ratify what I maintained in my lecture? So there is a sense in which Einstein's approach to physics involved word games, the disconnection between experiment and theory. Next. So it's important to understand that what was so revolutionary and caused such controversy about relativity was Einstein's adaptation of Mach's positivism, this idea that we should look only at what the observer sees and not worry about mechanisms or processes or an ether or anything else that might be going on to give rise to this. So that's why in special relativity, Einstein reduced it to two principles. The speed of light appears constant to all observers, and the laws of physics are the same in all inertial reference frames. Well, when Heisenberg came to Berlin to present one of his first lectures on quantum mechanics, Einstein invited Heisenberg home, and Heisenberg wrote about this in his book Physics and Beyond in 1970, years after Einstein's death. But the way Heisenberg described it, Einstein was very disturbed by the fact that in Heisenberg's quantum mechanics, there was no such thing as an electron path or a trajectory. And Heisenberg quoted Einstein back to Einstein, arguing that we should focus just on the observables, that we're not measuring the path, we're only measuring where it ends up. That bothered Einstein, and according to Heisenberg, he replied, perhaps I did use such a philosophy earlier and also wrote it, but it is all nonsense just the same. Next. So if you look at who really influenced Einstein, it's clear in his early career, Mach was one of the primary influences, that physics is all about observables and we don't imagine fundamental physical causes like the ether. But Einstein was also deeply influenced by a Dutch philosopher and scientist of Portuguese Jewish extraction, Spinoza, who argued that there were deep causal connections between everything in reality, even if they weren't obvious. So Mach, for his part, even in his old age, commented that he accepted relativity just as little as he accepted the existence of atoms. And at that time, Einstein argued that his mode of thinking was much closer to positivism than it was later on, that his departure came only when he developed general relativity around 1915 or so. Next. Let's go to the next slide. So the question is there only one kind of physics? And many people who tackle this question and look at whether there's such a thing as Jewish physics default to the answer that there is no such thing as Jewish physics because really there's just physics. But even one of the scholars I found making that argument acknowledged one's cultural milieu may contribute to one's approach and the way one approaches problem seeking and answering questions. So it's worthwhile to step back and consider other approaches to physics. And three that I want to identify and highlight here are an English approach, a French or continental approach, and then the German Naturphilosophie approach. Now, the English approach to physics has long involved a focus on mechanisms and models. As I already mentioned, Sommerfeld said, an Englishman would never have put forth a theory with non-constructive and non-visualizable dogmatics like special relativity. Wilhelm Wien wrote to Ernst Rutherford that relativity theory is something you Anglo-Saxons will never understand because it requires a genuine German feeling for abstract speculation. Now, we can trace English physics all the way back to the 13th century. I mean, one of the first English physicists was Robert Grosseteste, who did fundamental work in optics and the experimental method. His student, Roger Bacon, was one of the first experimental scientists and laid out the principles of induction that were taken up by Francis Bacon and others later. Of course, Isaac Newton was the quintessential English physicist. leading to the view of a clockwork universe. Michael Faraday and James Clerk Maxwell applied that in electrodynamics, coming up with the concept of fields pervading space. And Oliver Heaviside and Heinrich Hertz brought that to fruition with their work in electromagnetics. And of course, ironically, the physicist responsible for putting the capstone on the English physics program was Heinrich Hertz, who was not only German, but also half Jewish. So clearly, being English is not necessarily a requirement for practicing English physics. Next. Now, at the same time, there was also a French or continental approach to physics that looked more at mathematical models and abstraction for gathering deeper knowledge. You can look at Pierre-Louis Maupertuis, for instance, who generalized Newtonian dynamics with the principle of least action, or L'Hopital, who thought Newton's laws were a priori deductions of pure thought. And Lagrange, who declared he had no use for figures and diagrams, only exact algebraic expressions. And this is what I talked about last time, the notion of a Platonic or deductive approach to physics. The French continental school liked physics to be kind of like Euclidean geometry. We have a few well-described, well-defined, well-accepted axioms, and we deduce from those axioms the physical laws. Of course, that was very similar to what Einstein did with special relativity. Next. But now we get to German physics, and one of the key intellectual figures of German culture is Johann Goethe. He was not only a scientist, but also a philosopher and poet. Some people call him the German Shakespeare. He wrote a very famous play. Of course, the concept had been tackled by other people, but he had his own version of the play Faust, the famous play in which a scholar sells his soul to the devil in order to achieve knowledge and worldly gain. And one thing in that play caught Heisenberg's attention, and he quoted a long passage from which I'll just give you a small snippet, where Mephistopheles is counseling Faust. I counsel you, my dear young friend, a course of logic to attend. Your mind will then be so well braced in Spanish boots so tightly laced that henceforth by discretion taught will creep along the path of thought, and not with all the winds that blow go will-o-wisping to and fro. So that illusion of the Spanish boots, the infamous torture device that the Inquisition would clamp around the legs and feet of people to crush them and extract a confession, is described by Goethe as imposing these bounds on reason. Of course, Goethe's view was that you shouldn't tightly lace the Spanish boots, that you should allow your reason free realm and be willing to entertain paradoxical and potentially contradictory ideas. And ironically, I found that exact same phrase about not lacing the spirit in Spanish boots in the writings of Nernst when he was arguing back, long before quantum mechanics was argued to have made this happen, that reality had to be acausal and we shouldn't lace our thoughts in Spanish boots by demanding causality. So this was clearly a key concept that the German physics community was thinking of. Next.
Right. So the Spanish boots are like an Iron Maiden for your feet, right? So it's like that's the picture there is the spiked steel put around. So that's it for people who just have audio.
Right. Well, now what we talked last time a little bit about the beginning of the controversy on relativity, leading up to Einstein's visit to America. And that had a really devastating effect, not only on Einstein, but also on his critics. Einstein dismissed his critics as ignorant or anti-Semitic in a famous New York Times interview upon coming to America and elsewhere. And that really became a self-fulfilling prophecy. Next.
Interesting.
So I want to go back and talk a little bit about some of his leading critics. One was Philip Leonard. I mentioned him a little bit earlier. Leonard's mentor was the German Jewish physicist Heinrich Hertz, and Leonard actually spent a good year or so working on the proofs of Hertz's book after his death, and making sure that his mentor's last book came out correctly. He had a lot of respect for Hertz, and later in life described what a great scientist he thought Hertz was, despite the fact that he was half Jewish. He assisted Röntgen on his pioneering work developing X-rays, and was not happy that Röntgen did not give him credit. He claimed J.J. Thomson, a British physicist, had plagiarized him, but nevertheless, through his diligent experimental work, he won the 1905 Nobel Prize for his work on cathode rays and for identifying and measuring the photoelectric effect. And that was the same physical phenomenon that Einstein got his Nobel Prize for ultimately, but for providing a theoretical explanation of it. He was an outstanding lecturer. Even Einstein's girlfriend, who became his wife, wrote a letter to Einstein while attending lectures from Leonard and extolling what a wonderful lecturer he was. He's put as much time into setting up experimental demonstrations for his students as he did for his own research. And he carried on a cordial correspondence with Einstein. After Einstein's paper on the photoelectric effect came out, they exchanged a number of letters and had a very, he didn't agree with Einstein's interpretation, but they had a cordial correspondence. But the events of World War I were really the turning point for Leonard. Leonard blamed England for setting France and Russia against Germany in World War I, and that's not without some justification. The British enforced a very strict and devastating blockade on Germany. In fact, they continued that even after the war ended until the final Treaty of Versailles was signed. Lots of Germans experienced privation and even starvation. Leonard's own son, Werner, died in 1922 from the side effects of that long malnutrition that he suffered during the war years. In fact, Max Born commented a mutual colleague, Karl Runge in Göttingen, was emaciated in a letter to Einstein and very angry about the fact. Well, in addition to his personal tragedy of losing his son, Leonard also became bankrupted by the hyperinflation. He, like a good German patriot, invested all of his money and his Nobel Prize winnings in German war bonds, and those got inflated away into nothing. And he was insulted by Einstein. Next. So in 1922, Einstein's Zionist friend Blumenfeld was good friends with a German Jewish financier, Walter Rathenau, and the three of them would get together in Rathenau's apartment and talk. At that time, Blumenfeld tried to persuade Rathenau that it was wrong for a Jew to presume to run the foreign affairs of another people. But Rathenau felt that he needed to show that Jews could be good Germans and could serve the German nation. And as a result, he ended up accepting the position of foreign minister in one of the Weimar Republic governments in February 1922. Rathenau supported the Versailles Treaty. He signed the Treaty of Rapallo with the Soviet Union, which angered a lot of the nationalists in Germany. And as a result, he ended up being assassinated in June 1922. Now, that event got Leonard into trouble because Leonard held Rathenau responsible for the hyperinflation that had wiped him out and was just beginning to take off, but had already had devastating consequences. So he refused to lower the flag of his institute to half-mast on the day of mourning that had been set aside. A communist mob broke into the building, dragged him out, and almost threw him in a river. It became something of a cause celeb, and we can point to this incident where, clearly from then on out, he had very strong political feelings and a very strong grudge against Einstein and the various Weimar governments in particular. Einstein, for his part at this time, fled Berlin and went to Kiel on the Baltic, where he had been working with a company called Schantz and had developed some technology for their gyro compasses. In fact, Einstein earned royalties on his patents up until just before World War II, and all of the German naval vessels, including the U-boats that were attacking Allied commerce, they used these gyro compasses that included some of the intellectual property that was developed by Albert Einstein.
Interesting. Never knew that.
So Leonard, in the wake of what happened to him upon that assassination, added a word of admonishment to German natural scientists to his pre-existing, more academic criticism of relativity. He pointed out or argued that there was a well-known Jewish characteristic of shifting from factual problems to the field of personal quarrel, and he called for the cultivation of a sound German spirit. He handed out these flyers at a major 1922 physics convention, and they weren't well received. In fact, Heisenberg was in the audience there and commented how tragic he thought it was to see Leonard engaging in these Semitic attacks on Einstein in particular and Jewish physics in general. When Einstein did get his award for the Nobel Prize in Physics, Leonard not only protested in private, but publicized his objections in a newspaper, which was a great breach of decorum. Now, the other anti-relativist who was one of Einstein's great foes and a proponent of the Deutsche physics was Johannes Stark. In 1907, he solicited Einstein to write an article for the journal that he was editor of, and he worked on the light quantum hypothesis, which is one of the key ideas in Einstein's paper on the photoelectric effect. In fact, Stark contributed so much that Lorentz referred to it as the Einstein-Stark hypothesis. About that time, Stark offered Einstein an academic post, but Einstein had already made other arrangements to go work somewhere else and declined the offer. Now, they got off on the wrong foot when Einstein, in Stark's view, Einstein failed to properly acknowledge his contributions and didn't quote him, or didn't cite him as a predecessor in his physical work. Nevertheless, Stark did get the Nobel Prize in 1919. Now, Stark started into the controversy in physics, taking the side of experimentalists against the theoreticians who were dominating the field. He argued that equated the emphasis on theoretical physics with this abstract, degenerate form of theoretical physics. Now, that got answered by Max von Laue, who pointed out at the time experimental physics was expensive, and that's why there was so much theoretical physics going on. Stark led a revolt of the experimentalists against the theorists in German physics societies, but ultimately got outmaneuvered by Wilhelm Wien, who ended up taking over and kind of shunting him aside. In 1927, Leonard wanted to retire and appoint Stark as his successor, but Leonard's colleagues rebelled and blocked Stark's appointment. So the anti-relativists really weren't able to get much significant traction in the physics community until the Nazis took power. But they declared themselves for the Nazis in the wake of the beer hall push. Stark said kind of flamboyantly that as the National Socialist Party entered their struggle for power, he closed the doors of his physical laboratory and stepped into the ranks of the fighters behind Adolf Hitler. Now, the beer hall push was an attempt in Munich to take over the government there. That was in November 1923. Of course, it failed. And in 1924, General Ludendorff and Adolf Hitler, who were the ringleaders, went on trial. At the time that trial started, Leonard wrote a manifesto that Stark signed on to. The manifesto argued that the spirit of restless clarity, which hates every work of compromise because it's untruthful, it's the same spirit that we see in the great researchers of the past, like Galileo, Kepler, Newton, and Faraday, and we admire and revere it in the same manner as Hitler and Ludendorff and their comrades. So that may be one of the first times someone compared Hitler to Faraday, Galileo, Newton, and Kepler. But that was really the big turning point for Stark and for Leonard, placing themselves firmly in the Nazi camp. Next.
Right. And then there's like Adolf Hitler saying it's Hebrews at poisoning and all that other stuff, right? So it's kind of like in the context. Yeah. It's like these guys are jockeying, but it's interesting because it's not just physics, it's the entire culture, like the movement against the Frankfurt School. So this is also can be seen in the context of that, of this also kind of how ethnicity and maybe culture influences what should be kind of a cold, dispassionate science. And I think a lot of that politicization we've seen in the U.S. recently too, a lot of politics influencing what a woman is and things like these.
Yeah, we're focusing just on the physics aspect of it, but of course there's a lot going on in the broader culture in Weimar Germany than just a squabble between Einstein and his Nazi physics critics.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, they really ultimately were not terribly successful. Leonard, by that time, had pretty much retired. He wrote a book, Great Men of Science, and he wrote a 4-volume science textbook, Deutsche Physik. Stark had some initial success when the Nazis came to power, getting academic, bureaucratic positions in the government, and was very heavy-handed. He met with some academicians and told them if they weren't willing to get on board with his program, he would use force. He was not well appreciated in the community. In fact, in 1936, he was denied elevation to the Prussian Academy of Sciences because pretty much every other physicist, or a vast majority of physicists, did not appreciate him. And he tried to destroy Heisenberg, as we mentioned earlier, but Heisenberg's mother managed to quash that. So he did manage to keep Heisenberg from succeeding Sommerfeld, but ultimately the anti-relativists weren't terribly successful, except insofar as they were part of the broader movement that forced many prominent Jewish scientists to leave Germany. One of their colleagues commented, "It's fortunate that Leonard and Stark are no longer young. If they still had their youthful elan, they would command what should be taught as physics." So, of course, the broader context of what happened in December 1932, Einstein went for a trip to Pasadena in America, and he would never come home again because in January 1923, Hitler became chancellor. The next month in February, the Reichstag burned down, giving Hitler and his Nazi government the excuse to expand their powers. In May 1933, over 50,000 books were burned under the direction of the propaganda director, Paul Joseph Goebbels. Jews were fired from their academic posts. Easily a quarter of all physicists who were Jewish got fired. Even people who were very prominent physicists like Max Born or Fritz Haber. Fritz Haber is a particularly tragic case. He was a thoroughly assimilated German Jew. He had converted to Protestantism in his youth. He was the physicist responsible for developing the Haber-Bosch process, which synthesized nitrogen out of air, creating fertilizer and literally creating bread from air. Now, that same technology that made fertilizer also made the nitrates that were needed to make explosives. So his science was critical not only in feeding Germans during World War I, but in providing them a source of nitrates for explosives when they were under a blockade and they could not access the foreign sources of guano, bird and bat deposits that they would normally use. And yet he also was forced into an exile.
Yeah, he was a real loyalist. Like he was 100% German loyalist,
He
native loyalist, and I think he revolutionized really agriculture worldwide, right? Not just Germany.
Oh,
In the
absolutely.
process,
That
yeah.
process is a large part of what keeps people fed today, and we have Haber to thank for it. And
Yeah,
the Nazis were not terribly grateful.
no, not at all.
Um,
They should have been.
yeah. Now, one final note. We talked about Einstein's personal life a bit and how abusive he was to his first wife before divorcing her and having an affair with his first cousin and then marrying her. Now, he had two sons, Hans Albert, who grew up to be a very well respected professor of civil engineering. His other son, Edward, was diagnosed as being schizophrenic and institutionalized. And on the eve of World War II, Einstein was busy trying to help Jews escape Europe, writing letters of recommendation, trying to get them permission and visas to get out. He said he ran a little refugee office from his cluttered lawyer desk, helping Jews escape Europe. He got a letter from his ex-wife Mileva seeking his help. Now she was a Serbian Orthodox Christian living in Switzerland. Even if the Nazis had annexed Switzerland like they did Austria, she'd have probably been okay. But their half-Jewish son, Edward, who was institutionalized in a mental institution. I mean, if the Nazis had taken power, it would have been all over for him. He would have never made it to a concentration camp because often the Nazis would just shoot mental patients out of hand. And yet, despite that, Einstein, as far as is known, never replied. He wrote to Paul Ehrenfest, something I mentioned last time, that in Einstein's view, valuable persons should not be sacrificed to hopeless causes, and that held true even when it was his own son that was the cause. He wrote his other son, Hans Albert, if I had been informed, apparently of a potential genetic mental issue in Mileva's family, Edward would never have been born. And of course, necessarily that would have meant Hans Albert wouldn't have been born also. So, Einstein had a very troubled relationship with his family and was not the wise and sainted figure that he was publicized to be.
He's become kind of like a figure, almost kind of like Marilyn Monroe or Elvis in this kind of promotion and him riding on his bike and his tongue out and humanitarian. But
yeah, I think I mentioned that last time that the Hebrew University in Jerusalem that has the rights to his likeness has earned something like $250 million from licensing the Einstein image, everything from the little Einsteins to anytime his face has appeared, they're demanding their cut for licensing his image.
wow, amazing! He's worth more since he's passed away than in life, or should have been, could have been.
So the upshot of all this was a bitter, obviously very bitter polarization in physics. On the one hand, you had German physicists like Ernst Gerke, who acknowledged anyone who criticizes Einstein is either called an anti-Semite or someone who is too stupid to grasp the theory of relativity, or both. And on the side of the German physicists like Leonard, Leonard was arguing by the mid-1930s that natural science is of completely Aryan origin and Germans must today find their own way out into the unknown. And that polarization made it very difficult for people to look at relativity objectively. Another physicist, R.A. Houston, writing in his treatise on light in 1938, commented, "Relativity is now accepted as a faith, and it is inadvisable to devote attention to its paradoxical aspects." Now, it's kind of interesting seeing the fates of the anti-relativists after World War I. Now, Leonard, by that point, was in his 80s and was so frail that they didn't even bother putting him on trial. Stark was a bit younger and was sentenced to 6 years in prison, but he ended up having that sentence commuted to a 1,000-mark fine. One of the really interesting cases was Paul Wayland. Now, remember, he was the guy who started the working group of German scientists for pure science that somehow came up with a large amount of money to hire physicists and rent the Berlin Philharmonic, and no one really knows who was pulling his strings or giving him his money. He led a long career of con artistry and grifting across Europe and even South America. And on the eve of World War II, he came home to Germany. And when he entered the country, the Germans threw him in Dachau. So he ended up spending World War II in concentration camps. After the war, he awarded himself a doctorate, called himself Dr. Wayland, and emigrated to the US. And one of the final things he did was try to persuade the FBI that he had secret information about Einstein being a communist, resulting in a rather large investigation, which is now available publicly through Freedom of Information.
Interesting.
Now, World War II was, of course, part of the foundational narrative that even today guides how we think about America. I really like the quote by the comedian Norm Macdonald, who said, it says here in the history book that luckily the good guys have won every single time. What are the odds? It's that narrative of the victors writing the history that still governs us today. And just as World War II and its events are important to our understanding of the broader politics and culture of the US and the rest of the world, that debate between Jewish versus Deutsche physics informs modern physics. The interpretations of present-day relativity and quantum mechanics, though, that debate and all of the dramatic effects it had in the personal lives of the participants kind of overshadows the actual philosophic ideas that are at the root of relativity and quantum mechanics. And it boils down to primarily being, not really Jewish ideas at all, but rather the positivism of the Austrian-German physicist Ernst Mach and Goethe's Naturphilosophie, as channeled through Mephistopheles in his play Faust. So we don't need to belabor the point, but Einstein didn't really live up to the hero caricature. He had a lot of personal weaknesses. He tended to answer dialectic with rhetoric, dismissing criticisms as being anti-Semitic or ignorant without actually engaging with them. He was very jealous of his own priority while being very careless, recognizing the contributions and priority of others. Now, it was kind of interesting to me to see how this more realistic, if less complimentary picture of Einstein is really beginning to enter the mainstream of physics today. In fact, just a few years ago, the science writer Paul Halpern wrote in an essay in Physics Today, which is the mainstream magazine for practicing physicists. He wrote, "The relationship between Einstein and the press is a case in which a scientist's fame triumphed over the substance of his work." I mean, Einstein's fame was so hyperbolic, not even Einstein could quite live up to the reputation that the press tried to make for him. And Einstein acknowledged that. He commented he had been given a publicity value which he did not earn. And that was not necessarily a good thing. He also commented that the newspapers have mentioned my name too often, thus mobilizing the rabble against me, in a letter to Max Planck.
Interesting.
Now, one anecdote really drove home to me the importance of the whole Einstein narrative in physics. I've already mentioned how $250 million has been earned licensing Einstein's legacy. But not long ago, I came across this kind of obscure account by the physicist Freeman Dyson, writing in the foreword of the new quotable Einstein. Dyson, in December of 1981, was walking around the Princeton University campus around Christmas. Most everyone was gone. It was a dark and rainy night, he said, and then a military truck pulled up to the institute there in Princeton, Israeli soldiers jumped out of the truck and went inside and started bringing boxes down and loading up the truck. And then, when they were done, they climbed on board the truck and drove away. And that was Einstein's papers and the archive being removed from the Institute for Advanced Studies in Princeton and being transported to their current resting place at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And that would be an Israeli military operation, apparently, if we're to take Dyson's word for it, to do that. Kind of shows the geopolitical significance of Einstein and Einstein's legacy.
It wouldn't be the first Israeli military operation on the U.S. soil for sure. That's not part of our discussion, but
yeah.
Anyway.
So really, I've said a lot of negative things about Einstein, but I want to close by pointing out that his personal story does have something of a redemption arc. He pioneered the concept of focusing on observables in his theory of special relativity. But he came to reject that approach when he saw it applied to quantum mechanics, telling Heisenberg, perhaps I did use such a philosophy and also wrote it, but it's nonsense all the same. His appreciation and adherence to Spinoza's idea of reality being connected and causal is what led him to say that God does not play dice with the universe. And he pointed a way to the resolution of quantum paradoxes in what ended up being his most cited and perhaps most influential paper in the long run. Not anything he did on relativity or the photoelectric effect, but rather the paper he did with Podolsky and Rosen, the EPR paper, that argues quantum mechanics is not a complete theory without possibly having additional hidden variables. So I think it's interesting to just take a moment and acknowledge his despite his flaws and defects, how he may ultimately have ended up rejecting some of the worst errors of modern physics and pointing the way to a solution.
Interesting.
So this is, our discussion here today is excerpted from a number of articles I've published on my Fields and Energy Substack. That's at etherzar.substack.com, AETHERCZAR.com.
Right. I have it here. Let me see if I can pull that up. Share screen. Present. Here it is right here. There it is. So there's your Substack and then also your website too, which is also aetherzar.com, right?
Right.
And you can be contacted through that. I think this whole discussion is interesting because I think you can tie it to current events where there's a lot of ethnicity involved and there's a lot of ethnic sensitivities in today, whatever it could be. It's not just Jewish, white people or whatever it is. It's just there's always some friction and competition too. I think in a lot of ideas, like maybe celebrities compete against each other. Sometimes for the public publicity, intellectuals and academics do the same thing. And some people may not understand that or realize it, but sometimes they're very vicious fights and personals. I think Kissinger, I always remember this famous quote by Kissinger is like, academic fights are always the worst. I can't remember verbatim, but because there's so little at stake or something like that. It kind of comes to mind. Like, and then also the celebrity thing also distorts the actual work. And it's easier for people to kind of gestalt personalities and actually go into the details and sift through actual, the hard digging of figuring out what people's work are in context of other academicians or other physicists' ideas. And it extrapolates over everything. So it's really is. This is a current issue. Like, how important is that?
Well, it was very interesting to me to see how Einstein had very negative views about the Israeli war for independence and thought that the Zionists were too harsh. I mean, he was an advocate of the two-state solution. He thought that Jews should live in peace in Palestine with the Palestinians, and the views that he expressed, particularly comparing the Herut party, which of course became the Benjamin Netanyahu's Likud party. He was comparing them to fascists and Nazis, and today that would be kind of a scorched earth offense, but back in the day, that was he was forgiven and actually offered the presidency of Israel just a few years later. So it's
there's a lot going on. I mean, it is interesting context. It's kind of like jockeying, elbowing, and also the impression about people that they haven't. But he's still seen, like, his legacy, aside from his kind of like public image. His legacy as a real physicist is legitimate. I mean, do you agree with that?
I do. I mean, certainly. Well, I've highlighted a lot of the issues with his work. With the, he left himself open to accusations of plagiarism by not citing his sources. I think one of the areas he probably gets more credit than he deserves is in the whole E equals MC squared idea, which was one of his papers, but had a lot of predecessors. And in fact, Einstein wasn't the one who ultimately came up with the general proof of that concept. But he did have very creative work that he did on the photoelectric effect. In fact, I think that was the one paper he never got any accusations of plagiarism on. And we can take issue with his approach to special relativity for his emphasis on observables instead of on underlying mechanisms. But I think people like Oppenheimer and Born himself and Rutherford, who pointed out that it's an aesthetic appreciation of the approach. The approach works. You might not appreciate the way it's formed or the approach he took, but you can use it to do science. But what I would advise is not to focus on it to the exclusion of all alternate approaches. There are many ways to do physics, and you really do need to have a balance of the kind of deductive, coming up with physics from axioms approach that Einstein pioneered in his earlier life, and the more inductive, well, let's look at what's going on with quantum mechanics and try to figure out the hidden variables from the problems that we're seeing with it.
Right. So some of these things are not really as much arguments over content as much as style. Would you agree with that, or aesthetics? Style could be synonymous with aesthetics, maybe?
A lot of it is style. I mean, part of the issue is when you are approaching physics from this deductive point of view, it's very easy to work yourself into a sterile system of thought that is focusing on just coming up with ever more elaborate models to approach the data instead of stepping back and trying to come up with alternate models and alternate explanations on an inductive basis.
Gotcha. Great. Thanks so much for your presentation. Thanks so much for your time. This was part 2 of Einstein Relativity and Modern Physics. And check out our other shows that I've done with Hans Schantz. The first one I did in May, and then The Whys of Heart, a modern-day reimagining of the Scopes monkey trial. And I'll put links to his website and to his Substack in the show notes, so check those out as well. Go subscribe. Hans Schantz, Schantz. And again, we talked about Einstein relativity and modern physics. Thanks so much for your time.
Oh, thank you.